Right, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to this session on offline mobile access, where no connection is no problem. So first off, you have to suffer through a little bit about me. So I'm Keir Bowden. I'm CTO of BrightGen. We're a Platinum Cloud Alliance partner in the UK. I've been working with the Salesforce platform and the various offshoots like the Mobile SDK for just over 9 years now. I'm 15 times certified, including technical architect, so I've done quite a lot with Salesforce in that time. And I'm also a Salesforce MVP, so I've done quite a lot of these types of presentations in the past. And I'm better known in the community as through my Twitter handle, Bob Buzzard. Okay, so here's a really great quote about offline mobile access, which I'm going to read to you, even though you can read it yourself. So offline support is the mobile app feature continually underscoped by developers and oversimplified by stakeholders. So I've lost count of how many times I've had requirements from customers saying, all we want is our 60,000 product library on the device with 70 gig of videos and a whole load of presentations. And as soon as we get any kind of connection, we want the whole lot to be resynced with the server. Any kind of connection at all, even if it's a 3G connection, as we're moving around. And then I'll see developers look at this and go, well, that doesn't sound too hard. That's probably 5 or 10 days sort of work, so that'll be fine. So this is from a report by Forrester Research on the offline mobile challenge. And interestingly enough, this was written in 2014. And I personally don't think it's really got any better. I think we're still in a similar situation. So why offline? So on the right-hand side there, you can see some screenshots of various applications that will fire up when I have no connection, and most of them won't do anything very useful at all. A lot of them won't even tell me I haven't even got a connection. They just say they can't work, unable to do something, cannot do this, this isn't working right now, there is a problem. One on the bottom right does tell me that I have no network connection, and therefore I should do something about that. But interestingly, that's from a booking system. I can't remember if there's a flight or a hotel booking. So it's highly likely that I've opened that before and I've retrieved exactly that booking many times in the past, and yet it doesn't store it locally on the device. Every time it insists on going back to the server and getting exactly the same data. So reasons why you'd want to have offline access. The classic one is that you have no connection at all. So you're in a secure site. If you're in a Ministry of Defence site in the UK, you probably won't have your phone anyway, because they probably make you give that up when you entered the site. But if you do, you can pretty much guarantee that you'll have no connection. Or you could be in a basement or a boiler room if you're doing facilities management. So you've got an employee carrying out some work on a boiler, and they need to look at their device to find out some information. They need to have offline access there because it's unlikely there's going to be access points that far below ground. Or you could be on a plane without Wi-Fi, which is thankfully becoming a bit rarer now, so we'll have the chance to work on planes as well, which is good. So that's the obvious one when you have no connection at all. However, there's also when you have a poor connection. So if you're genuinely mobile, if someone's driving you around and you want to look at something on your phone, or if you're on a train. So where I live in England, I'm about an hour, 45, 50 minutes train journey outside of London. And when I go up to London, the mobile signal is all over the place. Sometimes I have 3G, sometimes I'll have nothing at all. And on one particular memorable GoToMeeting call that I was on, I think I disconnected 18 times in 25 minutes. So you be in situations where you're genuinely mobile and there is a patchy service. And what makes this worse is that devices will often interpret packet loss as meaning the network is congested and overloaded. So if they detect packet loss, they'll often back off and give it a minute or two before they try again, which makes the situation worse. And finally, data isn't free. If you're always going, like I was saying about this booking application, if every time you're just going and getting exactly the same information to put it on the phone, if that's where the user is going to use it all the time, then why leave it in a server, which isn't the appropriate place for it, and then use their data every time to go and retrieve that same information? Okay, so to demonstrate offline access, I've created a little straightforward demo application. It should be familiar. It's a training system where you read and learn some information, and then you take a little quiz and answer some questions on it. This should be familiar unless you've been living under a rock for the last 3 years, or you haven't opened your eyes since you arrived at Dreamforce. And I've called it snail bed to ram home the point, because that's considered humour where I come from. Okay, so I'm going to jump out to my demo. Good, that's appeared. So I'm going to run all this on the simulator, so you'll have to take my word for it that it is using the Smart Store, but I'll share the code. I will share the code so you can see that it is. But demonstrating on a phone hooked up is a little bit braver than I decided to be this year. Okay, so I'm going to fire up this application, which will take a moment or two for the simulator to start. Okay, so we can see this over, if I just move some of these other bits and pieces out of the way. You can see this over here. So basically what we've got here at the moment is, because this is an offline mobile application, everything is being done through the phone. So at the moment, all I've done is install this application for the first time. I haven't gone and got any data. It's not pre-filled with any data. So it's empty. So basically, it's telling me there's no sections in the store. So for this particular app, what I haven't done is, as soon as it fires up, go and sync to the server and pull down any changes that may have happened and the like. Because for this one, my view is that the user should be in control of that. They might be opening it up just to continue with something that they already had on the phone. Why should they have to wait and consume data for me to go and check and maybe find out nothing's changed, or to go and pull down a whole load of other stuff that I don't care about at the moment? So initially, it starts off empty. And then I hit that button, and then it will go and retrieve data from Salesforce. So I've already logged into Salesforce before, and the mobile SDK has OAuth management in there. So once you've logged in, it'll store a refresh token on the device, so you don't need to log in again. It'll just go and get a new data token and be able to pull the data through. So now I've got a list of 2 sections that are on the server. So the idea is of these, I can then decide I want to learn something about BrightGen, obviously, because that's who I work for. And we've got 2, so we've got a section in here, a little bit of an introduction, and then 2 pages, which have actually got the detail. So this just has a little overview of BrightGen, what we do with projects, what we do with certifications. And as you scroll down, you've got a couple of questions down the bottom. So as you click into those, once you've answered the questions, click the check button, and much like other systems you may be familiar with, it tells you if you got it wrong, and you get another go. So then I click the right answer. So that tells me I successfully completed this page challenge and the date that I completed it on. So if I go back to the home page, I've now got a chip in there telling me that I've got some unsynced changes, because my code has updated some of the records in the smart store, in the cache where these records are, to say there is dirty data in there. So that chip then gets displayed if that situation is true. So if I go into here, I can see that it remembers the fact that I've done that particular page. I'm just going to flick through and do the next one. Okay, so that now takes me back to sections, and the section is marked with a tick. And again, I've got unsynchronized changes. So then I can click the button again, and that refreshes the information, and that's gone back to the server now. So that's now in sync with Salesforce. As you can see, the chip telling me I've unsynchronized changes has gone. I've cleared down the fact that I've got dirty data in the store. So that's the application. It's very simple, because the idea of this is to show you about the smart store rather than all the clever features that I can add into an application like that. Okay, so the architecture of the demo app. So it's a hybrid local iOS application, which means everything runs on device. You can have, if you have a hybrid remote application, that can all run in Dreamforce when your device is just like a local container for it. But because I want to do things with the storage on the device, then that's a hybrid local. So it's built with Salesforce and the mobile SDK. So Salesforce is my remote database, and the mobile SDK is built on top of, or is contained within Cordova. So Cordova is a container that allows you to build mobile applications, but with that, rather than having to learn things like Objective-C or Swift, you can build them using technologies you're more familiar with, such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you're a web developer, Cordova is a really nice way of being able to build mobile apps. And it makes a lot of device features available through JavaScript as well, which is a bit brute forcing everything, and it's not the most elegant, but you do get a lot of features in there. Then I've got some JavaScript. So this has got all my business logic. It's got all the code that's going to update my application, because it's a single page application. Everything takes place in one HTML page. And I intentionally haven't used any kind of frameworks like React, because again, the whole point of this is to show this sample application, to show the offline access. So I didn't want people to have to learn more frameworks before they could figure out how to use the offline side of things. We've got Smart Store. So Smart Store is a feature of the Salesforce Mobile SDK that basically gives you a local database, so I can work against that rather than the Salesforce remote database. And finally, I'm using Framework 7. So you may have noticed that application was styled to look rather like an iOS application, and that was all done by Framework 7. It's a really nice library. It's called Framework 7 because it's trying to look like an iPhone 7. And if you've used something like jQuery Mobile before, it's very, very similar to that. You've got kind of CSS markup, and you've got a lot of JavaScript, but it's much more lightweight, I think it's faster. I haven't used jQuery Mobile for a little while. And it's definitely less intrusive. It doesn't use progressive enhancement. So if you update a page, the page appropriately re-renders rather than you having to execute more function calls to get it to look nice. The only thing about Framework 7 is the documentation isn't fantastic. There's lots of samples, but you're kind of left to your own devices to figure out what is actually going on with those samples. And then we've got the data model. So the data model is really simple. Again, I probably wouldn't do a production application like this, but again, the whole point was to keep it as simple as possible for demo purposes. And also, I've kind of normalized the data model as much as possible, or sorry, denormalized the data model as much as possible, because it kind of shows some of the additional features of Smart Store, which I wanted to draw out. And effectively, section is just a collection of pages, and the pages are the things that actually have the details that you read, the question, the various answer options, which one's the right one, and that's just repeated as required, and it contains additional information like have you completed it, and the date and time you completed it. So the Smart Store, I need to talk about this a bit more. The Smart Store is kind of the secret sauce that makes all this come together. This is your local database that allows you to store records for access offline when you have no connection. So it's a NoSQL JSON document store, which means you just store complex JavaScript objects in it, so you don't have to worry about storing a particular type in it. For example, you wouldn't, in my case, I've got the concept of section and pages, and I store those as one kind of composite object. I don't have one database storing the sections and another database storing the pages and then hook those together. I can just stuff them all into one big object and put them in the database. So the Smart Store, the store aspect it can be thought of like a database. And then within that, you'd have a soup, and a soup can be considered like a table in that you would typically store the same kind of complex object in there, mainly because you have mechanisms for querying out that data that rely on there being certain attributes present. And apparently the reason it's called a soup is because it can store a soupy amalgam of Salesforce objects, which is obviously hilarious. And then a particular instance of a JSON document or JavaScript object, effectively, that can be considered to be a row in the database. Key thing about Smart Store is it's secure. It's obviously no good having this data on your phone that's secured in Salesforce if anything on your phone can then go dipping into it. So it is encrypted, and the encryption is tied to your user session, which means that if you log out and you had data on there that wasn't synchronized with Salesforce, you have lost that data. There is no way of getting it back, which is as it should be, because that data needs to be secure. So under the hood, what it is an object relational mapping wrapper around an SQL-like database. But you don't have to care about that. From your application's point of view, you can just deal with JavaScript objects, and it takes care of where those go. And it's a really easy entry point to it. It's just navigator.smartstore, navigator being the web view, effectively the local browser. Okay, so next thing we're going to look at is some of the code around using the Smart Store. So this is very heavily based on my example app code. It's been slightly simplified so that it fits onto a slide and we don't all have to try and figure out from a wall of text which are the key bits. But if you look at the example code on GitHub, it should look very similar. Okay, so first thing you have to do when working with the Smart Store is create a soup. And when you create a soup, because a soup is for a particular type of JSON object, you need to tell it some information about how to identify a record, so what the index paths are. And in this case, I basically said the indexes are the name and the ID. So when I'm querying or when I'm updating or when I'm inserting data, that's how you figure out if the record is there. It's based on those indexes. And then once I've created the indexes, I then execute the register soup method of the Smart Store property. So I pass in the name of the soup that I want, which is sections in my case, because sections is the kind of entry point to everything. I pass in the index specs, and I pass in two additional parameters. Everything in the Smart Store, like pretty much everything in the Mobile SDK, is asynchronous. So I'm always giving it a success callback and a failure callback. My failure callback is pretty much always the same error method, because if something goes wrong, all I can really do is surface it to the user and say something went wrong. There's not normally much I can do. It's normally a low-level problem somewhere. So my success callback, that will just be called to say that it has been created. So effectively, it either gets created or it doesn't. There's nothing really else you have to do. Once you've successfully created it, then you can look at caching records in that store. And to do that, there's a method called upsert soup entries. So if you've used the Force.com DML method upsert, it's the same sort of question. So if you see records already in there, they'll be updated. If there aren't any records in there that match the IDs or names, then they will be inserted. So again, I pass the name of my store sections. I pass a collection of records that I want to go into the section, into the soup. And then I have an upserted callback and I have an error callback. So my upserted callback, what that gets back, which I actually think is really nice, is a list of the records that had been inserted into the soup. So the reason that's nice is because otherwise I'd have to go off and run another asynchronous method to go and query those records out of the soup so that I could do something with them. But those are kind of the records from the soup rather than the initial records that I put in. So they've got one or two additional pieces of information that are required to allow it to work with the soup. And once my callback is executed, basically I got back my list of the records that went in, and then I can go through and process them. So my sample application, typically I'd be requesting all the latest records from Salesforce, be upserting them into the soup, and then I'd be processing each record by writing an entry into the list of sections. So if I want to get to the sections and I haven't just cached a load of information in there, I haven't upserted, so I need to actually go and get that information, then I need to create something called a query spec. So a query spec is basically just saying, this is the type of query I want to execute and here's some additional information for it. In this case, because I'm querying everything, so I don't know whether for some reason I'm putting everything out again, maybe the user's done a back after they've been in a different part of the application. So all query spec basically says, give me all the records, and then I just pass it some additional information. So how I want it ordered, I want it ordered by name, I want it ordered ascending, because that looks nice, and I want to limit it to a maximum of 100. And I can do that because I know in my sample application I've got a maximum of 2. Actually, pulling back 100 and displaying those on a mobile device probably wouldn't be the greatest user experience anyway, but not something I have to particularly care about. And then I execute the query soup method. A query soup method, again, this pattern should be very familiar. I pass the name of my soup, I pass the query spec that I've just created, success and error callback. My callback in this case gets an additional parameter, but it's not a collection of records, it's a cursor. And that's because there may be pagination, there may be too much information for the smart store to be able to pass me back in one single go. So I have to then get some information from that cursor. So while I could paginate, again, I've only got 2 records in my sample application, so I make the assumption they'll all fit into the current page list of ordered entries. So I just pull those, check there's more than 0 of them, just a bit of defensive programming in there, and then I can wander through and carry out probably the same processing that I would if I upserted them into the database. So that's querying all the records. A lot of the time I want to query a single record. So for example, we have the list of sections, the user then clicks on a section, I need to go and get some details of that section, send them off to the list of pages, send them off to a new part of the application. So for that I need an exact query spec. I don't want to just pull back everything and process it myself. So in this case, the exact query spec, I'm querying on the ID, which has to be an index path of records in the soup, and I'm passing it the section ID. And that section ID has typically come from my HTML markup. I'll put it in as a data attribute or something like that. So when the user clicks on the link, I'll figure out what the ID is, and then I'll pass that into the method that's actually going to execute the query. And then once again, I'll just do query soup. Same concept as before, pass it the sections, pass it this query spec, success and error callbacks. And when I've queried a single record, again, it's exactly the same kind of concept as when I queried all the records. I've got my current page ordered entries. However, in this case, I know there's going to be a maximum of 1. So defensive programming again, check there's more than 0. If there is, then I use the 0th entry and I put out the page information of that. And the final operation on a soup that I do is I clear it down. And I do this when I synchronize with the Salesforce server. So basically, again, pass it the soup, pass it the success or error. And this is, again, one where it'll either succeed or it'll fail, and I don't get any more information about that. So what's interesting about this when I'm clearing the soup is that typically I'll do this when I'm synchronizing with the Salesforce server. So what I'll do is first off, I'll send my updated information, my dirty data. I'll send that back to Salesforce. Then I'll get an asynchronous callback to say that's been dealt with. Then I'll clear the soup. Then I'll get an asynchronous callback to say that was successful. Then I'll request some data from Salesforce, and I'll get that back through an asynchronous call, and then I'll upsert that into the soup, an asynchronous call. So I've got 4 asynchronous calls to orchestrate there. So that's kind of one of the challenges when you're doing this kind of development, is that everything is asynchronous, and sometimes you have to do multiple operations. It'd actually be a really good use case for promises, but I didn't use promises because, again, that kind of, I didn't want people to have to learn promises before they can understand the example application. Okay, so that's all well and good. That's the local smart store, but obviously my data has to come from somewhere. I'm not creating this data out of nothing. So I need to access Salesforce in some way, shape, or form. So how do I get my records from Salesforce in the first case, and how do I write back the changes? So quite nicely, querying the Salesforce data through the mobile SDK, I can run SOQL queries, which is really cool. I'm really familiar with those. I can try them out in Execute Anonymous or something like that to make sure that it gives me the information that I want, and then I can put that into my mobile application. And it's subqueries, it supports most of the stuff that you'll be familiar with. Once I've built my SOQL query, I can then execute that through the query method of the Force.js library that is bundled with the mobile SDK. Once again, called the SOQL query, success callback, and error callback. Success callback, again, it's a function that gets an additional parameter. But it's not the same sort of parameter, or not the same sort of information I get back from the smart store. In this case, I've got a result which has got some other information in it, if I care about the underlying details of how that result got on. And then I've got some records in there, so I have to pull those records out and then do what I need to with them. So what I do is I upsert the soup entries, so I write them into the smart store. Pass them in as a second parameter there, the recs that I've retrieved from the result, and I've put a kind of inline anonymous function there just to show that that's where I'm handling the items, mainly because I didn't want to put yet another callback on another slide. It didn't seem to be adding any value. And then finally, there's updating the Salesforce data. So in this case, the way I decided to do it was to create a custom REST endpoint, because again, I didn't want to have to introduce things like Smart Sync, because that was kind of blurring the lines of what I was trying to show here. So I simply create a JSON format request. It's a post request, posting back in JSON format. That's the path to my custom REST endpoint, and the data is a collection of records that I've probably queried from the Smart Store asynchronously. And then I execute the Apex REST of the Force.js library, and that sends that information off to Salesforce, passing it the request, and again, as always, success and failure callbacks. So that's all well and good, but if you're anything like me, when you write code, nothing ever works first time. Often doesn't work 10th or 12th time, but certainly never works first time. So this is my favorite quote about debugging. It's probably my favorite quote in the entire world. The fine art of debugging, also known as kill me now. So Mark Pilgrim wrote this in the HTML5 up and running book, and he was talking about offline HTML5 access through the web cache. It isn't that bad debugging hybrid applications, but it's not an awful lot of fun. So a little bit of advice around that. I'm just going to show you how I would debug the application. The key thing is, again, to use the simulator, because you can get a bit more information from that. So I'm going to stop my application, so get my Safari to the forefront, start my application again, give that a moment to fire up. So I can then do, if I've got Safari open when I start the simulator and start my application, I can go in the developer menu of Safari, and I've got a simulator entry. So what I can do here is I can ask Safari to attach to that running simulator process, to attach to the web view that's contained within that, and allow me to interact with it as I would any kind of other web page. So if I hit that, what I get is a web inspector. What I can't do, sadly, is kind of control-click and highlight things and view them in the list of markup on the left-hand side, in the list of elements rather. But what I can do is open the whole thing up, and then I can kind of scroll down, and as I get to things, you'll see they start to highlight as I hover over them, so I can get at and look at that HTML and see what's actually been rendered, which is really useful if I'm dynamically rewriting the DOM in a single page application. Really useful to be able to look at that kind of thing. And I can also go over to the console, which at the moment is empty because I've attached to a running process. I don't know what happened before I got there. And obviously, if I do things, then I'll be able to see the console logging come out there. However, that's all well and good, but what if I want to see what happened at startup? What if I've got a problem in creating the smart store, instantiating a soup? So what I can do is just reload, and reloading effectively restarts my application. And if I go up to the top, I can see I've got kind of my debug logging that's coming out there. So my authentication has succeeded. I've instantiated the store, I've created a soup, and then I've gone and retrieved the information from the soup, and I've put that out to the page. So definitely, if you possibly can, do your debugging on the simulator. You can't always. Sometimes you have to go onto an iOS device. And that's when I find I'm back into the kind of death by 1,000 alerts. So, you know, at 1, at 2, loaded sections, the worst user experience you can possibly have. Or maybe a hidden div that's accessible via a menu item or something like that. But it's a lot more challenging to do it on device. So if you can do it on the simulator, that's definitely the way forward. Okay, so that's debugging. Definitely do it via Safari, and make sure you have Safari running first before you start your simulated application. So if you start Safari afterwards, it can't see it. This kind of weird timing thing goes on, which can be confusing. Well, my machine, right. My machine's reluctant to paste on to the next one. So some lessons learned. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this talk is I hadn't done any offline mobile work for about 3 or 4 years. So it's probably changed, so I need to relearn it myself. But I also thought there's not that I can see being done in the Salesforce community about it. So what I'll do is I'll build something, I'll make loads of mistakes, I'll struggle with it, I'll learn some things, and then hopefully everybody else gets a slightly easier ride off the back of my suffering. So I hope you appreciate it. First lesson, learn JavaScript. Cannot stress this enough. When I did my first bit of mobile development, offline mobile development, which I think was 2013, 2014. I kind of knew some JavaScript, but I wasn't great at it. And what it meant was that, like, every time I did anything, I got it wrong. I wasn't really sure how many brackets I needed. Sometimes I seemed to have to put an additional bracket in when I was declaring a function and executing it immediately. I didn't really know any of that. So as I showed in the debugging, you can get in there and you can see if there's a syntax error, for example, you can load that. But if you're doing that every time you make a change, you've got to start the simulator, you've got to attach through Safari, you've got to go down through the log, you've got to maybe reload the application. It's not a lot of time, it's only a few seconds each time. But if you're doing that literally every time you make a change, if you're doing hundreds of those a day, you're going to burn a lot of time. So it's definitely worth spending some time getting to grips with JavaScript. And working on something like Lightning Components is a really good way of doing it because Lightning Components, it is JavaScript. You've got asynchronous callbacks to the server, so it's a really good way of getting to grips with it. Storyboard the application. Again, really useful. It's always useful if you're doing a single page application anyway, because you're kind of navigating around sections of the same page. But it's particularly useful with the mobile offline access because you've got so much asynchronicity there. So you've got so many things going on that you need to orchestrate. If you kind of storyboard and swim lane what's happening, you'll have a much clearer picture of how your application works. And that is, I can definitely recommend that because I didn't do that. And I spent an awful lot of time trying to figure out how I needed things to happen in a particular order. Like really big, probably the biggest mistake I made when I was building this application. Always good advice to avoid anonymous functions so you don't have the kind of inline function that I showed in the callback. However, I'm going to caveat this because if you have named functions everywhere, and you've specified a callback, which is used by one of the mobile SDK functions, and you've got a syntax error in that callback, then what will happen is you'll get this kind of wall of caught-over exception, which gives you no real information about where your problem is. Whereas if you just have an inline function that simply delegates down to your named function, and there's an error there, you'll kind of get more information about where it was. Never really looked into why it was, but if you're seeing that, then it may be time to introduce an anonymous function just while you figure out what the actual problem is. Again, standard JavaScript advice, always use your own namespace. My application creates 2 objects with their own names. So I know that I'm not polluting the window namespace. I know that if I introduce another JavaScript library, I'm not going to have any collisions. And something else that I found really useful is make small changes, because a lot of the time a lot of this stuff isn't really well documented, so you'll kind of be learning, you'll kind of be exploring as you go. And my experience was that things just break all the time as well. You change anything and it all stops working. The whole thing kind of collapses and you have to unwind it and figure out why that happened. So if you've only made a small change and then you've pushed it and you've tried to test it, you haven't got very much to unwind. You spend half a day doing everything and then you push it and the whole thing falls apart. It's kind of really irritating to waste all that time. And again, definitely happened to me while building this application. So something I would absolutely watch out for. Some lessons learned specifically around offline. Always go via the Smart Store. So if you've got a database on the local device, on the local device, use that. I started off with kind of a, not so much on this one because I'd done it before, but again, my first bit of offline mobile development, I had this kind of great idea that if I was online and I could detect I was online, I'd go to Salesforce, and when I went offline, I'd go back to the Smart Store. And you end up tying yourself in knots really quickly because you're kind of then constantly trying to sync things up to no great value. And also what happens if you're online and you've gone to Salesforce and then you suddenly drop offline, you've got to make sure that you've anything that you've done has been written to the Smart Store as well as to Salesforce. So you can end up spending an awful lot of time trying to orchestrate that, and it really isn't worth it. When I'm doing these kind of applications, I typically go via the Smart Store and then I leave it up to the user as to when we synchronize with the server. I don't do it when the application immediately starts up, and I don't automatically do it when the user just is carrying out their usual work. They have to say, yes, I want to synchronize with the server, I want to download some more information from Salesforce, then that works really well. Your mileage may vary, your application may be different, but certainly it's a useful technique. Use the latest mobile SDK. This is another one I'm going to caveat because I'm not using the latest mobile SDK. So when I was building this application, when I put my custom REST endpoint in there, it didn't work. I was getting really weird exceptions and I couldn't figure it out. I tried various tools that allowed me to exercise that REST endpoint. They all worked. Mobile SDK failed every time. Ended up looking on Cordova boards and all sorts to figure out if it was something I'd done wrong. Turned out to be a bug in the mobile SDK 5.1, which was fixed in SDK 5.2 because they don't normally worry about pushing minor patches like that. It's just easier to upgrade everyone. So lesson learned there. If you're hitting something, you do a bit of investigation, it's not obviously you, consider whether to upgrade. As I say, I'm going to caveat that because this is built against 5.2. I haven't tested it against 5.3 because to use 5.3, I had to upgrade Xcode and my Mac operating system, and I was trying to do this last week, and I decided that would be a very courageous decision this close to my talk, and I wasn't confident about it completing correctly. And the final lesson learned is offline is not magic. It can feel like it's a bit of magic, because you do feel like you've really accomplished something when you're able to write to the local store and pull it back again when you've turned your device offline. But it isn't magic. There's some different terminology. So you read about soups and stores and things like that, and it's not obvious what those are if you haven't done it before. The main challenge is around the asynchronicity, orchestrating so many asynchronous calls. That's where you can spend a lot of time getting things right in terms of, I need to do this asynchronous call, then I need to navigate somewhere, then I need to do a little bit more asynchronous call. Getting those in the right order can be a bit of a challenge. The biggest problem I found, there's really no examples out there. There's a GitHub repository for the mobile SDK which didn't have any examples of using the Smart Store. It had using the Smart Sync. But if you use the Smart Sync, you're then into, I think you need Mustache and you need Vue. And so there was like 3 or 4 additional frameworks I had to learn in order to be able to use that. And I really didn't want to do that. I want to do something really simplistic. So hopefully, my GitHub repository at least makes that slightly better. And we do have at least one example there now. So for more information on this, and I will share this deck, so you don't need to take photos unless you particularly want to. When you're building offline mobile apps that connect to Salesforce, there's typically 2 aspects to the application. There's the iOS hybrid application code, and then there's the Salesforce code. So 2 GitHub repositories, both of which are up there. And I was able to get some quite nice names for those as well, which I was quite pleased about. The link for the Salesforce Mobile SDK for iOS, as I say, make sure you use the latest version when you download that. Salesforce Mobile Developer Center, loads of good information and good advice there. And finally, Framework 7, if you're interested in looking at that. As I say, the documentation there isn't great. The product is, or the application, the library itself is great. It's really, really good, really fast. However, it's kind of for you to piece together the examples if you're interested in doing anything kind of a bit more over and above the standard stuff. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for listening. If anybody has any questions, then feel free to use the microphone now. I know people don't always like standing up, so feel free to come and talk to me afterwards as well, if you'd rather do it down here or outside. I'll be around for a little while yet. Thanks very much.